Good afternoon. For those that are not from Washburn, welcome to Washburn Law. For everybody else, welcome to the 47th Annual Foulston Siefkin Lecture. A special thank you, of course, to our lecturer, Professor Ron Hochbaum, who will shortly be delivering his lecture on cruelty, blame, and survival, homelessness in the age of Grants Pass versus Johnson. Every event like this always has to start with a very special thank you to Dean Lysinga and Anna. They make sure everybody is where they're supposed to be, that Professor Hochman got here on a plane, and that most importantly, pizza arrived in the back of the room in a somewhat timely manner, mostly thanks to some negotiation skills that I witnessed on the phone just a short time ago between Glory Days and Dean Lysinger. Of course, a thank you to Dean Jackson, who I saw there he is right there, Dean Jackson, for his continued and unwavering support for both the Washburn Law Journal and for events like this. We are very lucky to have a dean who is always willing to say, yes, go ahead and do that, and I will find the money somewhere to make that happen. And so not everybody is so lucky, and we should not forget that. And then, of course, a special thank you to the Foulston firm for continuing their support for this lecture series and really for the law school in general. My short remarks this afternoon come from my duties as the chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee. I work with Professor Rubenstein and Tyrell on that. The chair is a position that's long been held by my good friend, and not many people in the building remember him, maybe at least our faculty do, but the students, Professor Merle Duncan, who really took ownership over the journal during his career here. And he always told me how rewarding it was to be the faculty advisor for the journal. And you don't really appreciate that, I think, until you actually do it. It is the happiest bit of service that one can do. And Quentin is going to thank a lot of people shortly, but my job is to make sure we thank the really important people here, which are the students. This is an entirely student-driven endeavor. Quentin and Kinsey started working on this. Usually in this speech, I say in the early fall semester, but because it's Quentin and Kinsey, they were working on this in the late spring semester of last term. They picked the topic, they recruited the lecturer. Students next year will solicit and find articles to publish in issue 1 of volume 65 to go along with the professor's article that it's all students. In short, the students are driving the bus. My role is to make sure occasionally that it doesn't go off the roads, but that's a pretty easy job. The reward for this service is not my work, but it's watching their work come to fruition. And it's like a parent almost, and it's joyful. So anyway, I always like to say that this is really about them. And so now part of that, it's my pleasure to introduce the editor-in-chief of volume 64, he's happily, I think his role as 64 is coming to a close. Quentin Brown. I've gotten to know Quentin pretty well over the last 2 years. We didn't really know each other his first years. He was not tortured in my contracts class. First I got to know Quentin as an outstanding student in all of my labor and employment law classes. He's a frequent flyer in those classes and a joy. But this year, particularly, I've gotten a chance to work with Quentin not as a professor and a student, but really as a peer and a colleague, and helping to run the journal and seeking my advice when necessary. And he's great. I've loved working with him, even when he's giving me a hard time about the Dodgers in the World Series and things we will not talk about, right, Professor Francis? Right. We've forgotten that whole thing. But Quentin reminds me every once in a while. But despite that, I still love him like a son. So anyway, so please join me in giving a warm welcome to Quentin Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 47th Annual Foulston Siefkin Lecture. I would like to begin with thanking the law firm, Foulston Siefkin, for sponsoring this event. And since 1978, Foulston Siefkin has sponsored this lecture series, and we are incredibly grateful for their continuing support. I'd also like to thank all the attorneys and those from the firm who are here with us today or watching over Zoom. Additionally, I'd like to thank and recognize Kinsey Griffith, the Washburn Law Journal Volume 64 Senior Articles Editor. Kinsey has been an integral to the Law Journal this year, and this event would not be possible without her. She has spent countless hours planning, getting articles, and she's just been a great member. Along with Kinsey, there are a few members of the Washburn Law School faculty and staff that have helped us with hosting this event too. Staff members like Anna Smith, Ryan Purcell, and Carly Davis at the marketing have helped us to develop the great pamphlet that you have and all of the material that has gone alongside it. We would also like to thank Dean Leisinger and Dean Jackson. Dean Leisinger has always been on me to get this started fast and early, or we fall behind. And Dean Jackson has always supported our events and made sure to attend them and supported our ability to even host these events. So we're glad to have them every step of the way, and I'm very thankful. And then finally, I'd like to thank Professor Master Simone. He's our law journal advisor and has provided us in the support this year. Without him, there really wouldn't be a Washburn Law Journal or this event. So we're very thankful for him. And finally, I would like to thank Professor Ewert, the Sheila Reynolds Chair of the Washburn Law Clinic, who listened to our idea for the lecture series and connected us with Professor Hochbaum. Professor Ewert will also introduce Professor Hochbaum in a moment. I hope you gain an understanding of the Grants Pass decision and its effects on the unhoused through Professor Hochbaum's lecture. Thank you for attending.
Hello, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Ron Hochbaum, who is this year's Foulston Siefkin Lecture Speaker. He comes to us from the University of the Pacific McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, California, where he's the director of the Family Homeless Advocacy Clinic. He's been the clinical teacher for years, so has been inspiring and preparing future attorneys through his work at the University of the District of Columbia, at Loyola University Chicago, and Cornell University. Professor Hochbaum has dedicated his career to helping vulnerable clients. He has represented folks who are unhoused and folks who are trying to maintain safe, affordable housing, people who have had workplace justice challenges, people needing to access healthcare. And so he understands at a very deep level the intersection between the legal challenges, the economic challenges, and the social challenges facing our communities. And what you're going to hear today will hopefully help you think critically about what's going on and what your role could be as a voter, as a community member, as a future board of directors member of nonprofits, or even someone who might run for a public office someday, because he has great ideas about what we can do to address some of these problems. And you all, through your time at Washburn, are going to be very well equipped to address them. So thank you so much, Professor Hochbaum.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you all today to talk about this important topic. Before I get started, I also want to have a round of thank yous. I want to thank the Foulston Siefkin Law Firm for sponsoring today's event. I want to thank Associate Dean Lessinger, Ms. Griffith, and Mr. Brown for all their hard work in making today possible. And I want to thank Professor Ewert for thinking of me for this lecture. She and I have known each other for about 7 years now. She's been a tremendous resource to me over the course of my career. She's a thought leader in housing law and advocacy on behalf of people in subsidized housing. And I want you all to know that in the clinical world, we very much know that you have a special advocate, a special teacher, and a champion for justice here at Washburn. So thank you. So I'm going to start today's lecture with a little bit of framing. I'll admit that I'm skeptical of the US Constitution's ability to resolve homelessness. The Constitution can confer rights, but those rights are only as meaningful as a government's willingness to respect them. That's why for years, pre-Dobbs, right, women's reproductive rights advocates had to fight for efforts to limit government ability or accessibility to abortions. It's also why, before Grants Pass, cities, counties, and states twisted themselves in knots, figuring out how to get around the Martin v. Boise precedent. It's often said that homelessness is a choice, and I actually don't disagree, but not because I believe that a person chooses to be homeless or that a person made a bad decision that led to their homelessness, but rather because governments choose to leave people unhoused. In theory, the Constitution could confer a right to housing, but a government must choose to respect that right and create the infrastructure to make it meaningful. A government doesn't need a constitutional directive, however, to make sure that everyone has access to safe, affordable, and stable housing. They just need to choose policies that are effective in accomplishing that goal. So today, I'm going to start today's lecture by talking to you about the state of homelessness in the United States, as well as Shawnee County. From there, I'll introduce to you city, county, and state efforts to target people experiencing homelessness with criminal law. And I'll also introduce why scholars and advocates believe that those practices are segregation involved. After that, I'll discuss the grant's past decision and some of the jurisprudential history. And I'll conclude with the after effects of the decision, where it will go, and what you can do as engaged citizens and attorneys to resist these efforts to banish people experiencing homelessness and to erase their existence. Okay. So according to the 2024 point in time count, which is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's annual homelessness census, there are 771,000 people experiencing homelessness at any given time. Approximately 500,000 of those people reside in shelters, while 274,000 are unsheltered, residing in streets, encampments, and in vehicles. It's important to note that when I transition to talking about the misuse of criminal law, people experiencing unsheltered homelessness are disproportionately impacted by those laws. As this graph reflects, homelessness is on the rise and has grown rather rapidly as COVID's pandemic social safety net protections have expired. Since 2020, we've seen a 33% increase in homelessness. Between last year and this year, the number of people experiencing homelessness jumped 18.1%. I think it's also important to note that homelessness is not experienced equally among subpopulations, right? So while white people account for 75% of the general population, they only account for 32% of the unhoused population. Black people, on the other hand, account for 14% of the general population, but 32% of the unhoused population. Another troubling feature is in the rise of homelessness is that as our society is aging, so is the subpopulation of unhoused people. People 55 and over account for 19% of people experiencing homelessness, and many are becoming unhoused for the first time. Unfortunately, this year's point in time count data does not report on rates of disability among people experiencing homelessness, but depending on the studies that you look at, anywhere from 24 to 60% of people experiencing homelessness identify as having one or more disabilities. Finally, while many believe that homelessness is an urban phenomenon, the data doesn't bear that out, right? So 16% of unhoused people live in rural communities, and 40% live outside of urban centers. National trends are also present here in Shawnee County. The latest point in time count data shows that 537 people experienced homelessness, 61% reside in shelters or transitional housing, 39% are unsheltered. There are significant jumps in the data here as well. There's been a 30% increase between 2023 and 2024, and a 34% increase from 2020 until now. We also see racial disparities here in Shawnee, right? So 71% of the community is white, but they only account for 55% of the unhoused population. 9.7% is Black, but they account for 25% of the unhoused community. And 0.7% identify as Native American, but are 3% of the unhoused community. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the unhoused community is not a static group. So I couldn't find this data for Kansas, but if you look at this illustration for Los Angeles, every day the homeless response system is housing 207 people. But on that very same day, 227 are becoming unhoused. And so while the pit count is designed to give us a sense of the scale of the problem on a given day, it doesn't tell us how many people are entering and exiting homelessness over the course of a given year. So I'll turn my attention to the root causes of homelessness because this is a significant source of misinformation. To understand homelessness, policy experts think about this in terms of distinguishing between root causes and precipitating factors and individual risk factors. So in other words, you can think of this as why are so many people unhoused versus why is an individual person experiencing homelessness? And what we're often told about the root causes is not supported by data. So when we look at poverty rates, we actually see that there's a negative correlation, meaning the higher rate of poverty in a community, the less homelessness we see. When we look at mental illness, right, we actually see no correlation, right, which is why there's a flat line in this graph above. When we look at substance use, we see a slightly positive correlation. But if you look at the R squared, right, it's 0.06, which means that substance use is not a predictor in the rate of homelessness. Some folks think that the generosity of a social safety net in a given jurisdiction is a predictor. But again, here we see almost no correlation. And the R squared is even lower, suggesting that it has almost no predictive value. However, when we start looking at the cost of housing, we see what's driving homelessness. So here we can see the median rent has a strong positive correlation with the rates of homelessness. The higher the rent, the more unhoused people there are going to be in a particular jurisdiction. We also see that the average rent is a very strong predictor with an R squared of 0.57. Another predictor is vacancy rates, meaning the number of available rental units, right? So the lower the vacancy rate in a given jurisdiction, meaning the fewer available units there are, that is going to have a positive correlation with homelessness. So at the population level, right, root causes of homelessness are the cost of housing and the availability of housing. So if we return to this consideration of root causes versus precipitating factors and individual risk factors, it's not to say that someone experiencing homelessness might have a mental health condition or experience substance use concerns. It's that those factors are not what's driving rates of homelessness that we see. What is driving the rate of homelessness is the gap between people's income and the cost of housing. What is driving homelessness is systems that lead to income disparity and wealth gaps for people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, and women. For example, if we look at legacies of racism, right, we can point to employment discrimination. We can look at the racial wealth gap. We can look at redlining. And we can look at predatory mortgage lending. These structural conditions are what account for why communities of color are overrepresented among people experiencing homelessness. Many people experiencing mental health concerns may be locked out of a job market that can't accommodate them. However, many more live with mental health concerns and are able to work and are able to pay their rent. So in other words, mental illness might explain why an individual experiences homelessness, but it's not correlated to the rate of homelessness, meaning it doesn't account for why so many people are living on the street at any given time. So as you can see in this chart, right, median rent has outpaced median income for the last 20 years. In Kansas, for example, to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment, a family would need to earn $20 per hour. If they were earning the minimum wage, they'd have to work 112 hours a week. And this phenomenon is not unique to Kansas, right? According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there isn't a county in the country that a worker can afford a 2-bedroom house, right, or an apartment, we're earning the minimum wage. The final piece of the puzzle that accounts for the rates of homelessness that we're seeing is that rental subsidies are underfunded, right? So programs like Section 8 housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, public housing, these programs that are very effective at helping people exit homelessness and remain housed are not growing, while the need for rental subsidies is. At any given time, only 1 in 4 people that are income eligible for a rental subsidy get one. And that's because rental subsidies are not an entitlement like food stamps. Additionally, applying for a rental subsidy is complicated because housing authorities close their wait lists and don't let people apply at any given time. Even if you are able to apply, individuals and families often have to wait years to receive assistance, right? So in Kansas City, the average wait time is over a year. In Topeka, you have to live on the streets for 20 months on average. And in Wichita, over 3 years. So now I'd like to turn my attention to the misuse of criminal law and how it's targeted at people experiencing poverty. So I don't often use the terminology criminalization of homelessness because I think it reifies biases, but this is a descriptor that scholars have used, and it's defined as the outlawing of activities attendant to human survival, and sometimes the charitable acts intended to assist homeless individuals in that pursuit. And common examples include sleeping, camping, sitting and lying down, living in your vehicle, even sharing food. In Topeka, you have an anti-camping law, right, which prohibits camping near public infrastructure, which includes roads, by the way, within 10 feet of any doorway in certain parts of the city, which I didn't do a spatial analysis, but I imagine are downtown business districts, right, and by the river. A cursory review of Topeka's municipal code reveals many other sections, right, that are probably used to target unhoused people, right? So you have prohibitions on obstructing public ways, inhabiting vacant structures and vehicles, storing personal property, overnight parking, and park curfews. The range of punishments for these types of offenses is rather vast, right? In most jurisdictions, anti-homeless laws are an infraction or the equivalent of a traffic ticket subject to a fine. But in some jurisdictions, right, anti-homeless laws are a misdemeanor or a felony, punishable by incarceration in jail or prison. In Tennessee, for example, camping is a felony, and you can be incarcerated for up to 5 years. The targeted misuse of criminal law is problematic for a host of reasons, right? For starters, anti-homeless laws outlaw behavior that I think most of us would consider benign, right? Sleeping, sitting down, lying down, these are biological necessities. At some point, we all have to engage in it. Additionally, fining or arresting someone for conduct that they're involuntarily engaged in does nothing to address the problem and actually frequently serves as a barrier to accessing services that are necessary to escape homelessness. So, for example, a fine may be subject to wage garnishment, which drives unhoused people deeper into poverty. Alternatively, a misdemeanor or a felony conviction can serve as a barrier on job or rental applications. It also results in frequent contact with law enforcement, right? A 2015 study out of San Francisco found that 74% of unhoused individuals reported being approached by police in the last year. 20% were approached weekly, and 12% were reported being approached twice a week. So these are numbers that would undoubtedly trigger a civil rights investigation if applied to a suspect class. Compounding these problems is the fact that people experiencing homelessness are often not entitled to legal counsel, right? So when you're cited under an anti-homeless law, that's an infraction, right? That is not punishable by incarceration. You likely do not have a right to an attorney. Cities and counties may claim otherwise, but the ultimate goal of the misuse of criminal law is to force people experiencing homelessness out of their jurisdictions. Like, this is why, for years, scholars have described anti-camping ordinances and other laws targeted at unhoused people as segregation of all. So scholars believe this for a variety of reasons. First, because they target specific conduct, but are enforced in a manner to regulate public space like their segregationist predecessors, right? So with respect to the thrust of the laws, they target conduct that's unavoidable for unhoused people to engage in, right? And this creates a scenario where people are either forced to break the law or to flee the jurisdiction. These laws also give police broad authority to remove unhoused people from public space, which I'll address in more detail a little later on. Additionally, lawmakers are rather explicit about their desire to remove unhoused people from public space, right? So before grants passed, when governments were concerned with violating Robinson, the precedent that I'll address later on, they would not mention homelessness, right? So if you look at Honolulu's ban on sitting on the sidewalk, right, it does not mention homelessness. It's facially neutral, right? But if you pull up the legislative history, you'll hear city council members talking about the need to enact that ordinance to preserve photo opportunities for tourists, right? After grants pass, the intent to target unhoused people is getting more and more explicit if it's not mentioned in legislative language as itself. You can also look at neutral justifications of public health and safety that are put forward, right? Oftentimes these neutral justifications are put forward, but if we examine them a little bit more closely, we start to see a subtext, right? Specifically, an ongoing effort to equate unhoused people with danger, criminality, and the spread of disease. These are the same justifications that were used to prop up Jim Crow era segregation laws, right? For example, the need to segregate to protect white women from attack, or the need to bar people of color from pools or water fountains, right? Out of fear that that would expose white people to the spread of disease. Finally, we can look at the overrepresentation of marginalized communities. As I discussed before, people of color, and particularly Black and Native Americans, are overrepresented, as are people with disabilities. LGBTQ people are overrepresented. 17% report experiencing homelessness at some point in their lives. 30% of transgender people report experiencing homelessness at some point in their lives. And 40% of unhoused youth under the age of 25 identify as LGBTQ. When we look at women, right, women are not overrepresented among the unhoused population, but their experiences of homelessness are unique, right? So 20% of unhoused people are single mothers. Half of homeless women report having experienced gender-based violence. And 25% of adults cite domestic violence as the immediate and direct cause of their homelessness. As we know, all of these communities were or continue to be subject to some form of regulation and control with respect to their ability to occupy public space. And so in 2025, we're seeing rhetoric and governmental action that has frightening parallels to the era of Jim Crow. Grants Pass is actually a perfect example, right? So here's a quote from a Grants Pass periodical in 1859, right? That says, "The attitude of the people of this peaceful, law-abiding community toward the encroachments of Black, Brown, and Native American races of the land. We don't want you here. We won't have you here. You had better roll up your bed and ride." In 2013, when Grants Pass passed the law at issue in the Supreme Court case, the president of the city council is on record saying, "The point is to make it uncomfortable enough for them in our city so they'll want to move on down the road. Roll up your bed and ride versus camping here is illegal. Move on down the road." So One might ask, in what ways do anti-homeless laws actually operate to segregate people? Because as I said before, the laws also give police broad authority to remove unhoused people from public space. If you're a careful observer of the laws, you might notice that they allow for incarceration, right? So some people can be physically removed and detained, but other laws simply provide for fines. Both actually are of limited use to localities, right? Because there's not enough room in jails to incarcerate everyone, and a ticket can't prevent someone from doing something that's an unavoidable consequence of their being homeless. And so it's through extra legal frameworks that jurisdictions accomplish their segregationist aims, most commonly through sweeps. And sweeps are characterized by harassment, property destruction, isolation, and death. I suspect that many of you have read about sweeps in the news or observed some portion of sweeps, but to provide a technical definition of sorts, they are the forced displacement of homeless communities and people from an area, often under the threat of force, criminal sanction, or the destruction of property. Typically, law enforcement individually or with a public works department operate to remove an encampment. The reason I describe them as characterized by harassment is because anti-homeless laws lead to pervasive contact with law enforcement. I mentioned the 2015 report out of San Francisco before. That report also has data that shows that 93% of people camping, 88% of people residing on the street, 80% of people residing in vehicles were forced to move from public space. A similar report from my hometown in Sacramento revealed that nearly half of Sacramento's unhoused population were forced to move by law enforcement, and that they were forced to move on average every 2 weeks. Mind you, that was while fining and arresting people for sleeping outside was still prohibited in the Ninth Circuit. Equally alarming is the state's practice of destroying people's property, which despite grants passed remains illegal in the Ninth Circuit. So pursuant to Levon versus the City of Los Angeles, state actors are required to provide notice and to store unhoused people's belongings, making them available for retrieval pursuant to the 4th and 14th Amendments. In practice, Levon is violated constantly, right? So even when notice of a sweep is provided, cities resort to a variety of measures to skirt their obligations. They will designate property as soiled or damp, and therefore exempt from storage requirements. But naturally, if any of us was forced to live outside, our property at some point would probably become soiled or damp. Common examples of property that are seized and destroyed is food, clothing, survival gear such as sleeping bags and blankets, essential paperwork including social security cards, IDs, public benefits applications, work supplies such as tools and computers. People have had their medicine taken, assistive devices like canes, walkers, and wheelchairs, as well as family mementos such as photos, keepsakes, and even the cremated remains of loved ones. Sweeps are also characterized by physical and social isolation. So with respect to physical isolation, unhoused people are displaced to remote locations like riverbeds, train tracks, and highway underpasses. Cities also engage in containment strategies where they push unhoused people to particular neighborhoods. In Los Angeles, that's Skid Row. In San Francisco, that's the Tenderloin. Displacement and isolation also interfere with the work of social service providers. So case managers, street medicine outreach teams, lawyers have all reported permanently losing contact with clients and patients following sweeps. Social isolation occurs most obviously when enforcement disbands encampments and people lose touch with their networks. This, by the way, is often described by female and LGBTQ unhoused people as exposing them to physical and sexual violence, right? But the criminal laws also foster stigma, right? So labeling someone a criminal for sleeping outdoors breeds fear among people who are housed, and it breeds mistrust among people who are not. And then finally, sweeps are deadly for a whole host of reasons that I mentioned earlier and more. right? So harassment by government officials leads to depression, anxiety, and trauma. Destruction of people's property exposes them to hypothermia and the inability to medicate. Geographic isolation exposes people to violence. A 2023 Journal of American Medicine, or the American Medical Association study found that sweeps led to increased hospitalization, decreased utilization of substance use treatments, and premature death among 16 to 24% of the survey population. And then most directly, law enforcement and city personnel have killed people during sweeps, right? Just last month in Atlanta, Cornelius Taylor was killed by a front loader while his tent was picked up while he was inside of it. Atlanta PD's report actually tried to cover up the death and say that it was due to an overdose, and it took the coroner's report to describe in graphic detail what happened to his body. If you've been reading the local news, you may have read about a similar incident in Topeka. Thankfully here, it appears that the unhoused person suffered only minor injuries. But it became clear after the incident that Topeka had no procedure for actually checking whether people were physically inside tents before conducting a sweep. And now they've adjusted that procedure moving forward. All right, so now I'm going to turn my attention to Grants Pass, but I'll provide a little bit of historical background that will help us understand the court's reasoning in Grants Pass. So to understand Grants Pass, you actually need to understand the Supreme Court's prior rulings in Robinson versus California and Powell versus Texas. So in 1962, the Supreme Court heard the challenge of Lawrence Robinson, who was convicted of the crime of being addicted to narcotics. In that case, the Supreme Court found that Mr. Robinson's conviction was unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment. In its ruling, the Supreme Court concluded that a law criminalizing addiction was akin to criminalizing someone's status. It compared addiction to a disease that could be contracted innocently and not worthy of punishment. And Justice Stewart is famously quoted as saying, "Even one day in prison would be cruel and unusual punishment for the crime of having a common cold." Only 6 years later, the Supreme Court was asked to revisit Robinson in the Powell case, right? In Powell versus Texas, Leroy Powell was convicted of public intoxication. And Powell's attorneys argued that he was an alcoholic and that his public intoxication was an involuntary consequence of his condition. They posited that because of his public intoxication, they posited this because his public intoxication was a condition, and they argued that punishing him would equate to punishing him for the status of being an alcoholic. And in Powell, the court was deeply divided. A plurality of justices distinguished between conduct, public intoxication, and status of being an alcoholic, and ruled that public intoxication was not a consequence of status. In his concurrence, Justice White agreed with the conviction or helped uphold the conviction, but not because he didn't believe that public intoxication was an involuntary consequence of status and therefore potentially punishing status. He sided with the plurality because he did not believe that the record demonstrated that Powell was compelled to be in public. And so he wrote in his concurrence, "Although many chronic alcoholics have homes, many others do not. For all practical purposes, the public streets may be home for these unfortunates, not because their disease compels them to be there, but because drunk or sober, they have no place else to go and no place else to be when they're drinking. For some of these alcoholics, I would think a showing could be made that resisting drunkenness is impossible, and that avoiding public spaces when intoxicated is also impossible. As applied to them, this statute is in effect a law which bans a single act for which they may not have been convicted under the Eighth Amendment, the act of getting drunk." And so it was from that dicta that attorneys for unhoused people began arguing in the 1990s that criminal codes outlawing sleeping in public punished conduct that was an involuntary consequence of status. After decades of mixed results, the theory finally stuck when the Ninth Circuit took up Martin v. Boise. In Martin v. Boise, the Ninth Circuit did not strike down the criminal code prohibiting sleeping and camping and the like, but it did rule that enforcement of these codes violated the Eighth Amendment when jurisdictions failed to maintain enough shelter beds for all of the unhoused people in their jurisdiction. As such, the Ninth Circuit adopted Justice White and the Powell dissenters' involuntary conduct framework and found that sleeping and camping in public was an involuntary consequence of being unhoused and therefore punished status pursuant to Robinson. At that time, Boise did appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court denied cert. And 5 years later, the court reversed course and granted cert in Grants Pass versus Johnson. In Grants Pass, the city's municipal ordinance was just like many of the others I described before. It outlawed sleeping, camping, and the use of camping gear, as well as parking overnight in public parks. Punishments started with a fine of $295. A second offense led to a civil restraining order barring people from public parks. And then a third offense meant that you trespassed and violated the civil restraining order, and you could be found guilty of criminal trespass, incarcerated for 30 days, and fined up to $1,200. Justice Gorsuch authored the majority opinion, which overturned the Ninth Circuit's precedent in Martin, and held that the enforcement of, quote, generally applicable laws regulating camping on public property does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. And his reasoning was threefold. So first, he adopts an originalist interpretation of the Eighth Amendment to find that the Eighth Amendment's prohibitions relate to methods and kinds of punishment, right? And so there, he looks to Grants Pass methods of punishment and concludes that fines and incarceration are neither cruel or unusual, that they're common forms of punishment and not designed to inflict terror, pain, or disgrace. He continues on with an originalist interpretation, finding that the Eighth Amendment cannot prescribe what jurisdictions outlaw. And in doing so, he describes Robinson's status jurisprudence as an aberration. The court declines to overrule Robinson because Grants Pass and the plaintiffs in the case did not request it. And then finally, Justice Gorsuch reasons that Robinson doesn't apply to the Grants Pass municipal codes, even if you tried, because the laws outlaw conduct and not status, right? Adopting the Powell Court's plurality as reasoning. And here he explains that the laws are generally applicable and could easily be applied to a backpacker on vacation or a student protesting in the quad of their college. So in the wake of Grants Pass, what we're seeing is a race to the bottom, wherein cities, counties, and states are rushing to pass new laws, harsher punishments, and they are enforcing those laws more frequently. So the first thing with respect to new laws, they're taking several shapes, right? So some cities are passing their first ever anti-homeless laws. Others that already had anti-homeless laws, like a prohibition on sleeping, are enacting new laws like prohibitions on storing personal property, or they're modifying existing laws to make them more expansive. Here in Topeka, the city council amended its anti-camping ordinance that I showed you earlier, right, to prohibit sleeping in front of public infrastructure, as well as camping on private property, not public property, but private property, in excess of 10 days. A rather scary version of this recently came to be in the city of Fremont, approximately 45 minutes from San Francisco. And in Fremont, in addition to expanding the reach of its anti-camping ordinance, the city council passed a prohibition on, quote, aiding and abetting people in pursuit of camping. And despite repeated warnings that language was rather broad as well as vague, the city council elected to pass it nonetheless. And so a narrow interpretation of those laws could mean distributing camping equipment. It could mean distributing food or water, really any kind of charitable act or assistance. But a broad interpretation could include conduct that's designed to advocate on behalf of people experiencing homelessness, right? A case manager, a street medicine outreach worker, providing services to folks, or even the provision of legal advice to people living outdoors. Some jurisdictions are changing their laws by reclassifying the crimes and increasing maximum sentences. For example, infractions are becoming misdemeanors and felonies. We're seeing increased enforcement and increased sweeps. So in my hometown of Sacramento, the city makes public statistics of all of its arrests and citations and encampments. In the year and a half leading up to Grants Pass, the city issued arrests for 189 people. In the 8 months since, it has arrested and cited 543. Similarly, in Topeka, the city council recently allocated $12,000 to encampment sweeps and is in the process of a coordinated campaign to remove 20 encampments that they've identified throughout the city. We are also seeing increased investments in shelter being paired with enforcement. And these efforts acknowledge that if cities continue to conduct sweeps but don't have alternative places for people to go, then people are likely to just move a few blocks away to the other side of town. And so, again, to use our cities as an example, in Sacramento, there are 2,600 shelter beds at any given time, but 6,600 people experiencing homelessness. In Topeka, there are, I think, about 240 shelter beds, but 540 people experiencing homelessness. In all of my years of researching shelter capacity, outside of New York, where it's mandated by the state constitution, I've never found a city that has enough shelter capacity for all of the people experiencing homelessness within its jurisdiction. Another frightening development in cities' efforts to ramp up enforcement and build their shelter capacity is that they're beginning to designate plots of land for camping in lieu of building shelter, right? So in those cities, unhoused people are being forced to relocate to those plots of land and are being told if they leave, they will be cited or arrested. I certainly think that these new policies need to be studied more closely, but I'm really concerned that they have frightening parallels to Japanese internment or even Nazi-style German ghettos. The final phenomenon that we're seeing in the race to the bottom is busing. So last year, in the run-up to the election, we saw some conservative governors engaging in the practice of transporting migrants to liberal states. In reality, this practice is not new, and conservative and liberal elected officials have been engaging in it for decades, right? And so this practice actually gave rise to the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act in 1986. And so now in cities like San Francisco, we see the cities offering one-way bus tickets to unhoused people, regardless of whether those folks can demonstrate that they have housing or even a support network in the destination. So in this race to the bottom, the inevitable consequence is that we will bottom out. Right? Fining and arresting people for sleeping outside doesn't work because people have nowhere to go. We know this in part because these laws have been on the books in cities, hundreds of cities across the country for decades to no avail. And in fact, like I mentioned earlier, fining people, arresting them actually makes things worse, right? Because people lose contact with their social service providers. They have criminal financial obligations that drive them deeper into debt and deeper into poverty. Similarly, criminalization and shelter alone doesn't work because shelter is meant to be an emergency response, right? Not a permanent housing solution. So what works is housing and housing first, right? It doesn't take a policy expert or an academic to understand that the solution to homelessness is affordable housing. And the most effective approach to date is something called housing first. Housing first flips the traditional social services model on its head. So under the traditional social services model, program participants are often required to prove that they've, quote, earned their housing, right? So they may be required to get a job before they're put in housing, or they may be required to establish regular medical treatment before they're offered housing. Under Housing First, participants are put in housing immediately, and they are required to abide by three conditions. One, standard terms of the lease. Two, to pay 30% of their income towards rent. And three, they must agree to regular visits from a case manager or an outreach worker. Then, with the stability of housing, the case manager and the program participant can work together to achieve other goals like establishing regular health care or improving their health or obtaining a job. In numerous studies, Housing First has shown to be far more effective than the traditional model. So aggregate data shows that Housing First programs decreased homelessness by 88% and improved housing stability over comparative models by 41%. Those studies also showed that Housing First programs increase people's income, they experience better quality of life, they have reduced use of emergency room departments, and were less likely to use substances. While Housing First has been implemented with great success in countries across the world, the best example nationally would be the adoption of the Housing First model in the Veterans Administration. The Housing First model has been instrumental in reducing homelessness by 55% since 2010. Housing, however, should certainly be paired with prevention, right? As I mentioned earlier, even in homeless response systems like Los Angeles, there are more people entering homelessness than exiting at a given time. So one prevention technique that I suspect many of you are aware of is the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. By last count, 25 jurisdictions had adopted a tenant right to counsel with great success. But that right to counsel probably also needs to be paired with greater tenant protections, like just cause eviction, where tenants can be evicted only for things like non-payment of rent, lease violations, nuisance or criminal activity in the unit. They should also probably be paired with rent stabilization, where landlords' ability to raise rents is regulated. And then finally, we can engage in prevention by through the production of affordable housing, right? So this can be accomplished through zoning, including inclusionary zoning, where a certain portion of new construction is set aside for affordable units. We can accomplish this through tax incentives for nonprofits and for-profit housing developers, as well as public and social housing models that have been incredibly successful in Austria and Singapore. So typically, when I finish a presentation like this, there's a palpable heaviness in the room. And I think that's totally understandable, right? Homelessness is frustrating. It is incredibly depressing, right? I believe that we should feel sad that our neighbors are being forced to live on the street, or even worse, being incarcerated for their failure to be able to afford housing. So I'm going to try to leave you with a hopeful message, right? When I began today's lecture, I told you that I believe that homelessness is a policy choice. It's not a foregone conclusion. And I think that's where you came in, as was mentioned in the introductory remarks. There are many, many ways to get involved, right? So you can get involved with organizing efforts, right? By tapping into homelessness coalitions like the Kansas Statewide Coalition. You can volunteer for mutual aid efforts, distributing water, food, and camping gear. You can volunteer for the annual point in time count, right? Which ensures that Topeka and Kansas get the federal dollars that are tailored to the scale of the need in your community. You should also consider getting involved politically, right? Both locally and nationally. I imagine in the state's Capital Law School, Many of you will go on to careers in government. And so I would encourage you to look at the evidence, right? And adopt policies that work. For those who won't, you can still remain engaged citizens. You can call up your city council members and tell them that sweeps without an offer of housing is at best uninformed and most cruel. I've listened to dozens upon dozens of city council meetings, and I assure you that proponents of criminalization and fining and arresting people for sleeping outside are there, and they are loud. And then finally, you should use your legal knowledge and skills for good. Homeless legal defense projects are popping up all over the country to defend people against citations and incarceration. Attorneys and organizers in various states are drafting legal guides to help people file small claim suits when their property is illegally seized and destroyed under in violation of the 4th and 14th Amendment. And if you have the bandwidth, get involved in impact litigation, right? While the 8th Amendment might be foreclosed, the 1st, 4th, and 14th Amendments are still unsettled. But whatever you do, you should not let lawmakers obscure the root causes of homelessness and push people to the margins, right? In the hometown of Oliver and Darlene Brown, and many other parents that stood up for civil rights and forever changed our nation, you're uniquely situated to speak with power to the idea that no one should be excluded from public space or have their opportunities to enjoy safe, affordable, and healthy housing limited. Unhoused people are our neighbors, and so we should be reaching it out with an open hand and with house keys instead of handcuffs. So I want to thank you all for having me here today. I hope that you found this presentation illuminating and engaging, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
He's a professor. You can call on people if you don't raise your hand.
We have a hand.
Yeah, please.
I've seen on the news, California seems to get a lot of negative press in the homelessness world. And I wanted to ask your opinion about, because Governor Newsom has made housing at least an important factor in his likely presidential campaign and current governorship. I wanted to ask how you have found that to be genuine and seeking meaningful change?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the first thing to know is that Governor Newsom has done a lot of good things, but he is also a proponent of criminalization. And he has been since he was the mayor of San Francisco in 2010, when he enacted a variety of laws outlawing people's ability to be homeless in public. I think at the end of the day, like I said, he's done a lot of good, right? So it depends on which figure he's quoting at any given time, but he's invested somewhere between 22 and $40 billion in housing and shelter services and mental health supports over the first 5 years of his governorship. The problem, however, is that homeless advocates, right, or public housing advocates have told him, right, that you actually need double that over 10 years, right? And so he knows that while making these historic investments, right, they're not necessarily going to put a dent in the issue. And in fact, that homelessness will continue to rise because of the inadequate investments. One policy area in particular where people have been disappointed is the idea that with tax expenditures, in order to address homelessness and get to a point of stasis, right, where homelessness doesn't rise and we're housing everybody that falls into homelessness, we have to have year after year allocations, right? But in California, that had a state that has huge sort of budget booms and busts, right? He has been unwilling to do that. And in fact, now that we are in a budget deficit and crunch, he's cutting services for homeless. And so, you know, I certainly give him credit where he deserves that credit. But, you know, the incarceration efforts are incredibly expensive, including 2 state budgets, right? So in California, I didn't have the chance to look up this data for Kansas, but in California, to incarcerate a person for a year, it costs $110,000. That's not including sort of law enforcement response, the cost of the courts or any of that, just to keep someone in prison and to feed them. It's $110,000 a year. To pay for permanent supportive housing under that housing first model that I mentioned earlier, give or take $25,000 to $35,000 a year. Right. So it simply just doesn't make financial sense to pursue these policies. And it takes away really important allocations that the state would otherwise be able to.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Do you think a federal housing first program would work better than a statewide, or you think it should be more of a state kind of?
That's an excellent question. So the VA data I showed earlier was through the Veterans Administration, right? So we've demonstrated that we can do it at the federal level. The problem that we have sometimes with social welfare policy is what I mentioned earlier about the difference between these models, right? We often only want to allocate funds to people and communities that we believe are deserving, right? So oftentimes we say veterans are deserving, of course, right? They fought for our country, right? They may come back with disabilities through no fault of their own and fall into poverty and housing because they're unable to work or adjust, right, to the job market. And so that's why the Obama administration began that program and started ramping up allocations for rental subsidies through the VA. We just haven't seen those investments on the other side, right? Basically, since the mid 1990s, there has been no growth in the investment in federal housing subsidies. And there were significant cuts in the 1980s as well. So the part of why you ask an excellent question about states' abilities, right, is because with the realities politically at the federal level, what we see advocates pivoting towards, right, is state-led policy, right? So I had so many charts from the Center on Budget Policies and Priorities, right? And they recently created a brand new division, essentially, where it is to lobby, right, to provide an evidence base and to lobby state houses to adopt their own substance. And those have demonstrated to be incredibly effective. It's simply that those are not typically things that states will have been forced to invest in historically, right? But lots of states seeing an absence of leadership at the federal level, for decades now, are transitioning to thinking about what they can do. Yeah, please.
Have private prisons played a role in encouraging this sort of criminalization of homelessness?
Not to my knowledge. I suspect that undocumented migrants that are arrested under anti-homeless laws or cited under anti-homeless laws are ending up in private immigration detention facilities. But I don't think that that is where the vast majority of people who end up incarcerated are. So most of them are probably in county jails. And then I think I'll also just mention, right, that up until Grants Pass, and still now, although it's where lots of localities are shifting away from it, the overwhelming majority of these crimes were punished by fine. And only now that you see the Grants Pass case sanctioning incarceration and not really discussing like whether that is proportional punishment for these crimes, right? Are more and more people going to end up in jail and prison. I mentioned the Tennessee law, right, that makes it a felony, but I'm actually not aware of a prosecution under that law in Tennessee. And so I think part of this is also a facet of the fact that a lot of law enforcement understand that this is unproductive, right? I didn't have time to incorporate it in my presentation, but there are some excellent quotes. Is it Douglas County where Lawrence is? Yeah. So excellent quotes, I think either from the sheriff or the police chief in Douglas County that say like, look, I'll arrest someone and put them in jail, but then I just have to release them. And they go straight back out to the street, right? And so this is not a sustainable response. But to your question, I haven't seen that yet. But a concern that I might have, right, is that when prisons and jails get overcrowded, what will we do?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the busing issue, the church,
Oh, yeah.
and it's a local phenomenon too. There's been a lot of rumors, at least in Lawrence, when the city got the communities in Johnson County and sort of exurbs of Kansas City routinely ship their unhoused population to Douglas County, to Lawrence, where Lawrence is a little bit more attuned to trying to fix that problem. Have communities tried to sort of limit that in some way? Are there legal theories where one community can say you cannot externalize these costs and put them here, but we need to share fixing this problem? I mean, I'm sure it's happening at the state level too, but even interstate, you've got communities within one state moving these populations from one city center to another.
Yeah. So I haven't seen that yet with these new busing programs. I think it's been a while since I've looked at some of this, but I think that there was some old litigation in the EMTALA years around it, but I haven't seen that here. But I think that the inevitable consequence of the race to the bottom will be a pendulum swing back to cooperation. I think that may take a long time. And I think that a lot of people are going to suffer. And a lot of people in our community are going to get increasingly frustrated and angry, which again is why I encourage people to sort of speak out about this, right? Because until cities start to cooperate with one another, or states and the federal government provide guidance and leadership, either through preemption or whatever it might be, housing response, right? We're simply just going to see people sort of jockeying for position, and maybe sometimes even worse, right? Putting people who are not cognizant of what's going on and maybe don't have agency in the matter on buses to places where they have no relief, no support. Please.
In places that have trialed universal basic income programs, have there been any meaningful effects or incidental effects on addressing like causes of homelessness or just preventing homelessness?
You're asking about guaranteed income?
Yeah.
Basic income. So I'm not aware of the data internationally. I would say locally, oftentimes, so guaranteed income and UBI programs are they're conducted through like studies and pilots, right? They're not necessarily governmental policy and programs, and so oftentimes those studies are not studying people who are actively unsheltered, because it is hard to longitudinally study people that are experiencing that level of instability in their lives, right? And I think that's actually part of why the point in time count that I was describing earlier is designed the way that it is. But I suspect that if you look at any UBI or guaranteed income pilot that's specifically asking the question of are you more stable in your housing because of this, cash infusion or stable allocation of monthly income? the answer would be yes, right? You know, and so it doesn't have to be the rental subsidies that I mentioned earlier, right? It could just be welfare or guaranteed income, right? That gives people the stability that they need. But the problem is that those programs, those welfare programs, right, are not actually paying people at levels at which they can afford housing, right? So only half of states have non-disability based welfare, and oftentimes that's time limited, meaning you can only get it for like 3 months, 6 months, or a year before you're expected to go back to work. If you're receiving Social Security disability benefits, I don't know the exact figure for Kansas, but I think the benefit amount is like somewhere between $800 and $900.
I think $943 for SSI.
Okay, so thank you. We in California we have a state supplement that brings it up to $1,200, and so it doesn't matter, right? $840, $1,200. This is even if you can find housing, which I think would be a challenge for many. You will be what's called housing cost burdened, right? So you're paying more than 30% of your income. There's a budget principle that you should pay only 30% of your income towards housing, so that you can afford things like heat and AC and food, childcare, whatever it is that allows you to live your life, right? And so, yeah, I to your point, I think that UBI, guaranteed income, would be as effective, if not more effective. But those pilot studies are not tracking unsheltered homelessness, just folks that might have eviction histories or are at risk of losing their housing. But that at risk piece, I will say, is particularly important because of the inflow outflow that I mentioned earlier, right? For most people, they resolve homelessness on their own and relatively quickly, right? But if we provide, you know, even just temporary cash supports, they, you know, let's say if they lost their job and that's what led to an eviction or loss of housing, if we provide temporary cash supports or make sure that they don't end up on the street, right? They have that stability to go out, get another job, and not fear being unhoused again.
Thank you.
Please.
How do you recommend about addressing this issue and advocating, like as our roles as advocates, to like the general citizenry? Because I feel like even in our community, there's like a surprising amount of like controversy and resistance to even like bike lanes because of the stigma that the community result to those people that would use said bike lanes. So how do you recommend approaching that when a lot of it requires social buy-in from people who do have a certain stigma towards these populations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was talking to your predecessor on the Law Journal today about Derek Bell's theory of interest convergence, right? So the reason that we have so many of these criminal laws is because people don't want to confront visible poverty for whatever reason, right? Either because they're scared, because there's a variety of stigmas, because it makes them uncomfortable, right? They don't want to have to walk by an encampment. And I actually believe that people shouldn't have to walk by an encampment, but only because I think that people shouldn't have to live on the street, right? And people living on the street overwhelmingly don't want to live on the street, right? So any survey that you look at, well over 90% of participants list housing as their first and most immediate need, right? So they know what they need, right? And they say that if they were offered housing, they would immediately accept, right? So I know that there's a lot of misinformation about voluntary homelessness. Happy to talk to you more about that. But I believe that there is complete overlap between the wants of people who don't want to be confronted by visible poverty and people who live on the street, right? And we just have to get people to understand that that overlap is there, right? And that things like housing, right? Things like income are what we need in order to address this most effectively and expeditiously. Yeah, please.
In your opinion, can a meaningful change in the homelessness rate be affected by just increasing the federal minimum wage, or even in Kansas, we adhere to the federal minimum wage? Or does that need to go hand in hand with some sort of rent stabilization legislation as well?
Good question. I mean, certainly, what housing policy experts will tell you is that without increases to minimum wage, right, people living at the minimum wage are going to cycle in and out of homelessness regularly. And so that report that I mentioned earlier, you know, you can look at state by state data, right? But like I said, no state living under a minimum wage scheme are you going to be able to afford a 2-bedroom house, and I think it's in over 90%. You can't even afford a 1-bedroom unit as well. Certainly, we can have debates about like what raising the minimum wage means for the labor market and what that will mean for homelessness. I think that the data there has been mixed. People sometimes will say, you know, that if you raise the minimum wage too fast, right, then you could expect to see more significant rates of job loss, but other data studies don't bear that out. I think that, you know, landlords, property developers, land speculators, right, track these things very closely. They have incredibly advanced data models, right, to understand what they can set minimum rates of rent at in a given jurisdiction in order to maximize their profit model. And I think some of these data models are also revealing that sometimes, at least through big land ownership structures, there could be like some collusion at that level too, although that information is still emerging. But I think what I would say is that my initial reaction is we need sort of like all hands on deck, right? Whatever is going to get us out of the quagmire that we're currently in, we should be pursuing. I don't want a situation where you're pushing, you know, small business owners, right, small landlords out of markets, right, which often is raised when you're talking about rent stabilization schemes. But I also think that they are not necessarily the primary landlord model. And I also would say that many rent stabilization schemes exclude them, right? So you can craft a law to say that this is not a business model that we want to impact, and we can focus on bigger ownership structures. The challenge there, though, is that the rental market was vastly underregulated, right? So we don't even know sometimes who owns which properties, right? So if you go to Washington, D.C., where I practiced for a brief amount of time, you're required to register your property as a landlord, right? So they can keep track, and they know exactly how many properties belong to which landlords and so on and so forth. That's not a common regulation scheme, right? And so in a market that is this unregulated, right, where in most jurisdictions, tenant protections are sort of procedural, you get a certain amount of notice, and maybe you can rely on the warranty of habitability, right? That's unavailing for a lot of folks, and that's why so many people get evicted, right? I talked about the right to housing. That's I'm sorry, not the right to housing, the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. You know, in jurisdictions that don't have that, 98% tenants still unrepresented. But if you don't pair that, like I said, with things like rent stabilization, then you might not have the defenses that you need to make it as effective as it could be, right? So the presence of an attorney will matter, right? Folks will negotiate, but you still have to level the playing field in ways. But again, to your point, I think you probably want to see a little bit of both. Are we running out of time?
I think
Okay.
that might have to be the last
Okay.
question. I know there are other